There's a photograph that shouldn't exist, taken in rural Kentucky in the winter of 1951. It shows two infants lying side by side in a wooden crib, the Parish twins. But something about their faces isn't quite right. The eyes are too far apart, the mouths don't close properly. And if you look closely at their hands, you'll notice the fingers don't bend the way fingers should. The family buried that photograph in a metal box behind their barn 3 years later. They never spoke the twins' names again. Not at Sunday dinner. Not at funerals. Not even when reporters came asking questions after what happened in '58. This is the story of what came after those twins stopped being born human, and why the Parish bloodline tried so desperately to erase itself from history. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Parish family had been farming the same 200 acres of Carter County, Kentucky since 1873, 4 generations of unremarkable people living unremarkable lives. They grew tobacco. They attended the Baptist church on Route 19. They kept to themselves. But in the spring of 1951, Margaret Parish gave birth to twins in the upstairs bedroom of the family farmhouse, and something went wrong in a way that no one in that room could explain. The midwife, a woman named Ethel Combs who had delivered over 300 babies in her 40 years of practice, would later tell her daughter that she almost ran from the house that night. She didn't, but she never took another delivery call from the Parish family, and she made her daughter promise never to discuss what she'd seen in that bedroom. The babies were alive. That was the first shock. Margaret had carried them to full term without complication. The pregnancy had been normal by every measure anyone could observe. But when Thomas and Sarah Parish entered the world on March 14, 1951, the room fell silent in a way that births never do. They breathed. Their hearts beat. But their bodies had formed according to rules that human anatomy doesn't follow. Thomas's spine curved in 3 places where there should have been one gentle arc. His legs were different lengths, not by inches but by nearly a foot. Sarah's skull had plates that hadn't fused correctly, leaving soft spots that pulsed visibly beneath translucent skin. Both children had eyes that tracked movement but seemed to focus on points in space where nothing existed. The local doctor, Howard Brennan, made the drive out to the Parish farm the next morning. He examined the twins for 20 minutes in complete silence. Then he closed his medical bag, walked downstairs, and told Margaret's husband Robert that he'd never seen anything like it in 30 years of rural practice. He couldn't explain it. Genetic abnormality, perhaps. Some kind of developmental disorder that medical science hadn't properly categorized. But when Robert asked him directly whether the children would survive, Dr. Brennan looked out the kitchen window at the morning fog settling over the tobacco fields and said something that Robert would repeat to his brother years later. Survival isn't really the question we should be asking. The Parish family made a decision that day that would define everything that followed. They would keep the twins. They would raise them as best they could, but they would tell no one outside the immediate family about the children's condition. No photographers, no medical researchers, no church visitors bearing casseroles and sympathy. The twins would exist in the upstairs bedroom, cared for by Margaret and her mother-in-law, and the rest of Carter County would be told that the babies had been stillborn. A small funeral was held. 2 empty caskets were buried in the family plot behind the Baptist church, and Thomas and Sarah Parish officially ceased to exist in any public record. For 7 years, the Parish family maintained their secret with a discipline that bordered on religious devotion. Margaret quit attending church socials. Robert stopped inviting his brothers over for holiday dinners. The farmhouse became a fortress of silence, its windows curtained even in daylight, its doors opened only for necessary business. Neighbors noticed, of course. In rural Kentucky in the 1950s, people noticed everything, but the Parishes had earned a reputation as private people, and grief was understood to be a legitimate reason for isolation. If Margaret Parish wanted to mourn her stillborn twins in solitude, the community would respect that boundary. But inside that house, something else was happening entirely. The twins were growing. Not in the way human children typically grow, but they were developing nonetheless. By age 3, Thomas had learned to pull himself across the floor using his arms, dragging his mismatched legs behind him. Sarah could sit upright if propped carefully against pillows, and she had begun making sounds that might have been attempts at speech, though the words never quite formed properly. They recognized their mother's voice. They turned their heads toward light, and according to a journal that Margaret kept hidden in a box beneath her bed, a journal that her granddaughter would discover decades later, the twins had begun to communicate with each other in a way that didn't require language. Margaret wrote about waking in the middle of the night to check on the children and finding them both awake, staring at each other across the width of their shared crib, not moving, not making sound, just watching each other with an intensity that she described as knowing. She wrote about how they would sometimes cry at exactly the same moment, even when separated into different rooms, how they refused to eat unless they could see each other, how Sarah's soft spots would pulse faster whenever Thomas was in distress. Margaret's handwriting in these entries becomes increasingly frantic as the years progress. By 1956, she's writing things like, "They're teaching each other something," and "I don't think they're suffering the way we thought they would." The family doctor, Howard Brennan, made periodic visits throughout these years, always after dark, always parking his car a quarter-mile down the road and walking to the house through the fields. He brought medical supplies, antibiotics when the twins developed infections, specialized formulas when they couldn't digest regular food. But he never brought hope, because hope implied a future, and Dr. Brennan had stopped believing these children had a future sometime around their second birthday. He was wrong about that. But he was right to be afraid. In January of 1957, Margaret Parish discovered she was pregnant again. She was 34 years old. She hadn't left the farmhouse for more than a few hours at a time in 6 years. And according to her journal, she knew immediately that something was wrong with this pregnancy too. She could feel it, she wrote, in the way the baby moved, in the dreams that woke her gasping in the hours before dawn, in the way Thomas and Sarah became agitated whenever she entered their room, their eyes following the movement of her swollen belly with what she described as recognition. Robert wanted her to see a specialist in Lexington, someone who could run proper tests, who might be able to explain what had happened with the twins and prevent it from happening again. But Margaret refused. She knew, with a certainty she couldn't rationalize, that leaving the farm would be worse. That whatever was happening to the Parish bloodline was tied to this place, to this specific ground their family had worked for 4 generations. She made Robert promise that when her time came, Dr. Brennan would deliver this baby at home, just like the twins. No hospitals, no strangers, no records. The pregnancy progressed through the spring and into the summer. Margaret grew larger than she had with the twins. The baby's movements became violent enough that Robert could see them from across the room. Sharp, angular bulges pressing against his wife's abdomen, as if the child were trying to punch its way out. Dr. Brennan visited twice in those final months. After the second visit, he pulled Robert aside in the kitchen and suggested, very quietly, that they might want to consider terminating the pregnancy. It wasn't too late. He knew people who could handle it discreetly. Robert asked him what he'd seen during the examination that would make him suggest such a thing. Dr. Brennan didn't answer directly. He just said that in his professional opinion, Margaret might not survive the delivery, and even if she did, they might not want to see what she delivered. Margaret went into labor on September 9th, 1957, 3 weeks earlier than expected. It was a Tuesday evening. Robert was in the barn checking on a sick calf when he heard her screaming, not the controlled breathing and measured cries of normal labor, but screaming that echoed across the tobacco fields and sent crows scattering from the trees. By the time Dr. Brennan arrived 40 minutes later, Margaret had been screaming for so long that her voice had gone raw. And upstairs in their room, the twins were screaming too, their voices harmonizing with their mother's in a way that made Dr. Brennan's hands shake as he climbed the stairs. The baby was born at 11:47 that night. Dr. Brennan would tell his wife the next morning, in the private darkness of their own bedroom, that he'd been practicing medicine for 33 years, and he'd never seen a delivery like that one. The child had come out fighting, not crying, not gasping for air the way newborns do, but fighting with a coordination that shouldn't have been possible for something that had just entered the world. Its hands had gripped the doctor's wrist hard enough to leave bruises. Its eyes had been open and focused, tracking his movements with an awareness that made his stomach turn. Robert Parish stood in the doorway of the bedroom and watched his wife hold this new child, and he knew with absolute certainty that his family had crossed some invisible threshold from which there would be no return. The baby was a boy. They would name him Daniel, though they would never register the birth with the county. And unlike Thomas and Sarah, whose deformities were obvious and external, Daniel's wrongness was harder to define. His body appeared almost normal at first glance. All the parts were where they should be. The proportions were close enough. But something in the way he moved, in the way he held himself even in those first hours, suggested that whatever was inside that infant body had skipped several crucial stages of human development. By 3 days old, Daniel could hold his head steady without support. By 1 week, he was watching his parents with eyes that seemed to calculate and measure. And by 2 weeks, Dr. Brennan quietly suggested to Robert that they might want to keep Daniel separated from the twins. When Robert asked why, the doctor struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insane. Finally, he said that in his observation, the twins seemed to be waiting for something. And now that Daniel had arrived, they'd stopped waiting. They'd started preparing. Margaret's journal entries from this period are brief and increasingly cryptic. She writes about how the twins had become calmer since Daniel's birth, how they no longer cried or showed distress, how they would lie in their crib for hours, perfectly still, their eyes closed but their bodies tense, as if listening to something only they could hear. And she writes about Daniel, about how he never cried, not once, not even when hungry or uncomfortable. How he would watch her with an expression that reminded her of old men in nursing homes, people who had lived too long and seen too much. She writes one sentence that her granddaughter would later have tattooed on her ribs as a reminder: "I don't think I'm raising children anymore." If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what would you have done if this was your bloodline. The event that finally broke the Parish family's silence happened on October 31st, 1958, Halloween night. Robert had been in the lower pasture mending fence posts when he heard his mother screaming from inside the house. Not Margaret. His mother, Ruth Parish, a woman who had survived the Depression and buried 2 husbands without shedding a public tear. Robert dropped his tools and ran toward the farmhouse, his boots pounding across the hardened autumn ground, and what he found in the upstairs hallway would cause him to sell the farm 6 months later and move his family 3 states away. Ruth had gone upstairs to check on the twins, something she did every evening around sunset. She'd opened the door to their room and found it empty. The crib was there. The blankets were folded neatly at the foot of the mattress, but Thomas and Sarah were gone. At 7 years old, neither twin could walk unassisted. Thomas could barely drag himself across a floor. Sarah had never moved independently in her entire life, yet somehow they had left their room. Ruth had searched the upstairs in a panic, calling their names, checking closets and corners. And then she'd found them. They were in Daniel's room. The 1-year-old boy was sitting upright in his cradle, which should have been impossible for a child his age. And on either side of him, Thomas and Sarah had positioned themselves on the floor, their bodies arranged in postures that defied their physical limitations. Thomas was sitting up straight, his twisted spine somehow supporting his weight. Sarah's head was raised, her unfocused eyes locked on her baby brother with a clarity they'd never shown before. And all 3 children were humming, the same note, the same rhythm, a sound that Ruth would later describe to the minister as older than anything that should come from human mouths. When Robert reached the room, the humming stopped. All 3 children turned to look at him simultaneously, their movements synchronized like birds in murmuration. And in that moment, Robert Parish understood something that he would never be able to articulate properly, not to his wife, not to Dr. Brennan, not even to himself in the private hours of night. His children weren't sick. They weren't suffering from some genetic abnormality or developmental disorder. They were changing into something else, something that had been waiting inside the Parish bloodline for generations, maybe centuries, biding its time until the right combination of blood and circumstance allowed it to emerge. Dr. Brennan came to the house that night for the last time. He examined all 3 children. He took notes in his leather journal with hands that shook so badly he could barely write. And then he told Robert and Margaret something that no doctor should ever have to say to parents. "I think you need to contact someone outside of medicine. This is beyond what I understand. This is beyond what anyone I know would understand." When Margaret asked him who they should contact, he had no answer. He just gathered his supplies, walked to his car, and drove away. He would die of a heart attack 14 months later, at the age of 61, and his medical journals from the Parish case would be burned by his widow before anyone could read them. The Parish family left Kentucky in March of 1959. They sold the farm to a cousin for less than half its value with one condition: the buyer would never enter the upstairs bedrooms until the family had removed everything they needed. Robert spent 3 days boxing up medical equipment, burning Margaret's journals in a barrel behind the barn, and dismantling the twins' crib piece by piece. He buried the pieces in 6 different locations across the property, wrapped in canvas and marked with stones only he could recognize. Then he loaded his wife and 3 children into a truck in the middle of the night and drove west without telling anyone where they were going. They settled in a small town outside of Spokane, Washington, under a different surname. Robert found work at a lumber mill. Margaret kept the children inside during daylight hours and only allowed them in the yard after dark. The neighbors thought the Parish family, now calling themselves the Preston family, were strange but harmless, religious, perhaps, overprotective in the way some rural families could be. No one asked too many questions because no one wanted to be the busybody who pried into another family's private grief. And there was grief there. Anyone could see it. Something had broken inside Margaret Parish that would never fully heal. The children continued to develop in ways that defied medical explanation. By the time Thomas and Sarah turned 10, they had learned to walk. Though their gait was wrong, mechanical, like people moving in bodies, they didn't quite understand how to operate. Daniel grew faster than any normal child, reaching the height and build of a teenager by age 7. He learned to speak, but he rarely chose to, preferring to communicate through gestures and expressions that his siblings understood perfectly. The 3 of them would sit together for hours in the basement of the Washington house, arranging objects in patterns that Margaret couldn't decipher, humming in harmonies that made her teeth ache. Robert Parish died in 1973 at the age of 54. A brain aneurysm, the doctors said, quick and painless. But Margaret told her sister on the phone that in the weeks before his death, Robert had started talking about the farmhouse in Kentucky, about sounds he'd heard in the walls, about dreams where the land itself was trying to tell him something he'd been too afraid to understand. Margaret lived until 1991, long enough to see all 3 of her children reach adulthood, though what they'd become by then could barely be called adults in any conventional sense. Thomas Parish died in 2003 at the age of 52. Sarah lived until 2017, dying at 66 in a care facility where the staff knew her as a woman with severe developmental disabilities who hummed constantly and never made eye contact. Daniel is still alive today, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, living under a name that isn't Parish or Preston. He's 67 years old now. And according to the one surviving member of the family willing to speak about this history, Robert and Margaret's granddaughter Elizabeth, Daniel has children of his own. 3 of them. She's seen photographs, though she won't say how she obtained them. And in those photographs, she says, you can see it if you know what to look for, in the way the children hold themselves, in their eyes, in the slight wrongness of their proportions that most people would dismiss as unflattering camera angles. The Parish bloodline didn't erase itself from history. It just went underground, spreading quietly through the American population, waiting for the right combination of genetics and circumstance to express itself again. Elizabeth Preston, born Elizabeth Parish, now 62 years old, has spent the last 15 years trying to track every branch of her family tree, trying to warn the descendants of what might be sleeping in their DNA. Most of them don't believe her. Most of them hang up the phone or delete her emails. But some of them listen. Some of them have started noticing things about their own children that they can't quite explain. And some of them, late at night when they're alone, start wondering if the thing they've always dismissed as family eccentricity might actually be something older and stranger, something that's been patient enough to wait generations for its chance to finally become whatever it was always meant to be. The farmhouse in Carter County, Kentucky, still stands. It's been empty since 1987 when the last owners moved out after 3 months, claiming the upstairs smelled like copper and medicine no matter how many times they cleaned. The property has been for sale for 37 years. The price keeps dropping. No one stays long enough to complete a purchase. And if you drive past it on Route 19 late at night, Some people say you can still hear humming coming from the upstairs windows. The same 3 notes, the same rhythm, waiting for someone from the bloodline to come home and finish what the Parish twins started when they stopped being born human and became something else entirely.